Welcome back to another episode of the Overcoming Odds podcast. Today's guest is someone who I just met a couple weeks ago. Her name is Kelsey, Vander, Vliet. She's a birth mother, adoption paralegal, and future law student. I wanted to bring her onto the show to share on this topic that we've been covering for the past month or so, and that is this concept of belonging and why it is important to us as human beings to not only belong somewhere, but also ultimately belong to ourselves and find ways to love ourselves and accept ourselves for the things that have happened in our lives. So without further ado, I'd please like to welcome Kelsey onto the show. Kelsey, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I had come across your story, as I was mentioned before, a little while ago, and what interested me the most about your particular story was the journey that you went from being a birth mother and making the decisions within that, and then ultimately leading back into the field of adoption. I'm hoping that there will be a chance that we can further explore that within this episode, but the way that I would like to start this off is focused on this concept that I spoke with you earlier, and that is belonging, and ultimately why it is important to human beings to belong somewhere. So the question that I have for you is, what about that particular topic is important to you?
I think as humans, when we don't have belonging and community, we are going to constantly crave it.
Mm-hmm.
I think we crave mutual understanding and people that have experienced similar things or have, similar belief systems, etc. So I think it's something that naturally we want for ourselves, and when we find it, it can be life changing. It can really set the tone for your life when you have a good support system around you. So, yeah.
Do you remember a time when you were craving that?
Yeah. My whole life, probably up until after I placed my son for adoption. Yeah.
Very interesting. So how tell us more about that. How did that change kind of like your definition after a decision like that?
Yeah. I think growing up, I was in sports and music, and I did everything, and then college the same, and I think just emotionally there was always some pieces missing. I had a lot of friends, but I didn't have real people that really understood me. So and during my pregnancy, I lost a lot of friends. So people, I thought were my friends, but they just were, maybe party friends, or they didn't really care about me. It's like I thought they did. And so it was a pretty lonely time. And after placement, I was still going through a really lonely time, but eventually I found a support group in my area, in my hometown, for birth moms. And that kind of made all the difference, because I think that gave me my first little taste of community, of what it meant to have a real supportive community of women. And I chased after it continually from that point on, because once I found it, I knew it was real, and I knew it was out there and waiting for me somewhere. So I just kept looking.
You bring up a lot of very good points. The first point that I'm curious about, because I'm living on the other end of this, and that is someone who's been adopted. In your case, could you tell us a little bit more about your journey for those who may not be familiar with the process of giving up a child for adoption, as far as what was going through your mind and what made you do that? And then the second part of that question I have is, what made you want to go back into the field of adoption?
Sure. So I had just graduated college, and I moved back home with my parents, and it was a summer relationship, and I had no, it was a shock when I got pregnant, and I was planning on moving out to the West Coast, and I'm from the Midwest. And so everything kind of crashed around me when I found out I was pregnant, but I was like, you know what, I can do this. And the father kind of was like, no, we're not doing this. And he he was not supportive and he left like pretty much immediately. And so, and it was a shock because like he was a friend of mine and then he wasn't. And
Mm-hmm.
then I was completely broke. I was living in my parents' basement and that had a time limit on it. So I
Mm-hmm.
couldn't stay there. I didn't have anywhere to go. Um, so I had experienced, hardship kind of like that before, not with a pregnancy, but I was really frightened that I would be thrown back into something like that with a baby in tow.
Mm-hmm.
So I decided like adoption is going to be my best bet for this child to like not struggle and not, have these. I don't want him. He just got here into the world, so I don't want him to like have to, come along for the bumpy ride with me. So at the time, like, I did what I thought was best for him. And I found a really great family pretty close to me within 2 hours of where I lived. And um, I chose them. I got to know them and built a relationship with them and, asked them all the hard questions. And then in May 2016, I gave birth to him and I
Mm.
placed him, and we have an open adoption. So I visit with him a couple of times a year. When I was living there, probably like 5 or 6 times a year I saw him, but
Mm-hmm.
now I live out in Southern California, so I probably like twice a year now.
I see.
So, but we keep in contact, and he knows, you know, for as much as a 3-year-old can know his story, he knows the story, and we try to just do the best we can with that because it's tricky. Um, it's a delicate thing, and we want to make sure that he feels, loved and everything, but we want to make sure he feels like he belongs because I think as I've learned, it's also a struggle for adoptees, and it's always on my mind. Like I want to make sure that he has the freedom to feel everything that
Comes
he can.
along with it. Yeah.
Yeah.
How do
So
you tell me more a little bit about the decision of ultimately giving up your child? Like what was going through your mind? Like how did you and the other part of that question I have, and this is for anyone that's in a similar position, how do you process that decision afterwards? Because I'm sure that there's healing that has to come with that and acceptance. So
mhm.
what did you do? What did you do on your end to come to terms with what you had made?
I think during the pregnancy, I was really steady. And that's my personality. So once I get my mindset on something, I go after it. And, you know, maybe adoption wasn't that kind of a decision that I should have treated it like that. I think, my mind just gets on one track and I'm like, I'm determined and I'm going to make it happen. But I knew if I sat there and really thought too much about it that I wouldn't do it
Mm-hmm.
maybe, or I'd reconsider at least. And so I thought, I'm going after this, and that's just like me and my 22-year-old mind as well. So it was a different point in my life for sure. Um but coming it was once I had the baby, I think any mother will tell you like her first pregnancy, um when you don't have any concept of what's really going on in there. Like
Mm-hmm.
you're like, I'm pregnant, but like you're not making the connection that you're growing an actual life in there.
Mm-hmm.
But once I actually had him, it was shocking, like how I felt and like all the emotions surrounding it and the grief. And it was really hard once I had him. And it sounds so trivial because you're like, well, of course you're growing a baby. And I knew that, but you don't know how it feels until you have him.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a huge decision. And I never really grasped that until he was born. And I went ahead with the adoption, and I was, it's not something I'm like, oh, I have 100% no regrets. And I think, but there's nothing, you can change. And afterwards, you just go through so much grief.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you go through it in a different way than a death, but also so similar.
Mm-hmm.
You're losing a child, and you're watching somebody else do your job, and that's
Mm.
to come to terms with. But you go through, the 5 stages of grief, and it's cyclical. So you keep going through it. And acceptance is supposedly the last stage of grief, but you keep going through acceptance. Like you keep running through the stages and going through
Layers
different,
of it.
you grow with it. And acceptance is probably, for me, I'm very stubborn, so it's one of the hardest stages for me to really go through. So but I've learned to kind of tackle it in the right way, and understand my grief. And but it's a process. It's tough. He's going to be 3 years old in May, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm going through different things than I was going through last year and the year before, but it's manageable. And you just, every day, you take it day by day.
Mm-hmm.
So
Take us through. Could you take us through the 5 steps of grief that you had just mentioned for those who may not be familiar
yeah
with them?
yeah let me think, because it's 7 a.m., so let me think. The first one is denial.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I've not really gone through that too much since right after I placed. I think that's something that it's afterwards, it's just a shock of it all. And then I believe bargaining is
Mm-hmm.
second. And when someone dies, that's kind of like, God, take me instead.
Mm-hmm.
I'll do anything to have this person back. I think we go through a little of that, like, I'll do anything to have this person back. But I think it's also part of that for us is the what ifs. Like you play out in your mind, like whatever stage of life you're in, you're like, well, what if I had my child right now?
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of dwell on that in that space, and which can kind of be, it's nice in the moment, and then it kind of becomes destructive if
Mm-hmm.
you dwell there too long. And then the third one, I believe, is anger, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe that's the second one. I think that's the second one, and then bargaining is the third one. Anyways, anger is one of them, and that can be anything. You can be angry at anything towards the process of it. And then the fourth one is depression, and we definitely go through that.
Mm-hmm.
And then the fifth one is acceptance. Yeah.
Hmm. Very interesting. So, it's interesting for me to learn about kind of like the other end of the
Mm-hmm.
spectrum because, as I mentioned before, I was someone who was adopted, so I wasn't
Sure.
really able to understand until later on a lot of the reasons why I was
Mm-hmm.
placed into that particular field. But after learning about my family history and the different things that were happening at the time, some of the things I was able to make sense out of. The thing that interested me in regard to your particular story is that you shared about your journey of being a birth mother, and the other part of the question that I have for you is how do you deal with a lot of these labels? Do you, because what I'm noticing within this community is that depending, and not I mean this community, but just communities in general, when you're
Mm-hmm.
given certain labels, there are certain associations that come with it. When you are called birth mother, like what do you think of instantly? Is that a positive or negative experience or something in between?
I think it's up to me, or it's up to anyone to label it positive or negative. I
Mm-hmm.
think, to me, it's my role in the adoption triad, and it's who I am to my son, and it's really nothing more to me. I think um, I have no like desire to really make it any type of positive or negative, because it's not the
Mm-hmm.
same for everybody, and we can't make sweeping statements.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's, you kind of can teeter on the line of like propaganda when you get too rosy about it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, my choice did label me. And it doesn't bother me. It doesn't bother me to be called a birth mom, because that's what I am.
Mm-hmm.
But I also know that this is not my entire identity. And I think that's really important
Mm.
to know that's what you are, but
Mm-hmm.
also recognize that there's so much more to your life. Um, and I think I know so many women that get tripped up on that. And I was definitely one of them. And it's so important to sit down and look at your life and find your balance in all of it. And where are you giving your time? What are you putting effort into? And like your adoption, you should definitely be, I mean, if you have an open adoption, you should definitely be putting effort into it, but it should never consume you.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, you know, the term birth mom is, it's fine. It is what we are, but, you know, it's not everything about us.
Mm-hmm. How did you get back into, not back, but how did you get into the field of adoption from that experience?
So it was kind of weird. I didn't intend to. I started a blog, but I was just journaling to like help myself with grief.
Process. Mm-hmm.
And then I put it in a blog online. So I was like, maybe someone will benefit from this, you know, and I like to talk. So I like to share my story and I like to kind of see how I can help people. So it did pretty well. And then, the support group I was attending in my hometown, I didn't know it, but it was this agency in Indianapolis, and they came up for lunch with the leader of the support group one day, who was also a birth mom, and they asked me if I could come to lunch if I wanted to. And so I, you know, did what any decent person would do, and I lied to my employer about having a doctor's appointment, and I went to lunch with them. So so I went to lunch, and that night they called me and offered me a job out of the blue. So I never applied I just was going to lunch with them I think I was like seeking some community. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, I'll go to lunch with these people. They obviously have started this wonderful support group. Like they seem legit. I'll go see what it's about. And then they called me and offered me a job. And I don't think that was their intention either. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I kind of accidentally got into it. And then I moved to Indianapolis within 2 weeks, and I started working this job, and it was honestly the best job I ever had. I did education and outreach, and they took me in as a birth mom, and they said, we want you to change us from the inside out. And so they were already a really good agency, but they allowed me to make changes and make them into a great agency. And gosh, we made so many great changes in the year and a half that I was there. So it was nice because I see a lot of agencies that want to hire a birth mom, but they want the birth mom to come in and be their cheerleader. Mm-hmm. And for them, they wanted to be challenged, and they wanted their 30-year practice to be challenged to make it better and more ethical. And that was fantastic. I was like, I couldn't have a better start.
That's amazing.
My career. Mm-hmm.
You speak a lot about the community and the people that you surround yourself with. I recently I had a conversation with a friend of ours. His name is Nathaniel Williams, and he was talking to us about this concept of your 5 closest friends. Mm-hmm. And he was saying how his theory is that your 5 closest friends are not physical people, but it's behaviors that you look within people and that kind of like you mirror from day to day. Okay. My question to you is based on kind of like your role in the different communities that you found for yourself to help yourself heal and grow. What are some of the qualities that you're looking for within people?
The qualities. That's a tough question. I don't know. I think I look for honesty first and foremost. I look for kind of like a no BS type of personality, whether that's filtered or unfiltered. Like I just want the straight truth because that's the way that I am. I think, I think there's so much I think I look for that because in adoption, in the industry, there's so much BS to weed through. It's unbelievable. And I'm sure you've experienced some of that as an adoptee, but it's just so many layers of crap to trudge through. And so I think that's the first thing that I look for in people is, are you BSing me? Like what's underneath? You know, what's your motive? What's your ulterior motive with me? And after becoming a birth mom, I mean, losing friends, losing trust in people, being rejected by the birth father, you have a hard time trusting people after that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you look for someone you can trust, who's real with you. And then for me personally, I look for someone who understands maybe my experience or doesn't understand it, but tries to, or is there to listen, even if they don't get it.
Mm-hmm.
'Cause I don't just have birth mom friends, you know, I have other friends that are in the adoption community, and it's refreshing to have that because you don't always want to talk about adoption. But someone that gets it and is respectful of your experience, as I hope to be with theirs. And yeah, I think those are the main things that I look for with people.
Mm-hmm. Are there still elements of that going back a little bit to of the decision and maybe just like the ultimate experience that you've had that you still deal with?
Like, can you
Are
rephrase? Sorry.
are there elements that you're still processing?
Oh, of the adoption,
Mm-hmm.
like sure, yeah, probably forever. Probably forever. I think there's things I think I get over, I think I'm accepting of, and then it just comes back into your life unexpectedly, and you're like, damn it, like I'm not
I thought
over
I
it.
went through this already.
Yeah, I think for me, and I think it's helpful to look into yourself as you are as a person, and
Mm-hmm.
don't try to think that you're any other way than what you are built as. What's your personality trait, and then how does that play in? So I think for me, rejection is super hard for me to deal with. It's always been hard. It can knock me off my feet, and I
Mm-hmm.
think rejection from the birth father to me is kind of like, how dare you? So I think I still think about it. I've not talked to him in 3+ years,
Mm-hmm.
but it still is really hard for me to handle sometimes. And I it's so in the past, but if it comes up,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes I'm just like, oh, you have this disgust, it's
Mm-hmm.
hard to deal with. And then I think not having the support from some of my friends, I see that as rejection, and that's probably the biggest thing for me
Mm-hmm.
is the rejection of support and friendship. And yeah.
Final thought for today's episode, and I'm curious to know about this because, I think on different levels, we all deal with this subject, and that is, I think, trust, what you just mentioned. Especially, obviously, my life experience is different from yours, and any of the other listeners, they all have their own unique experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to trust, the biggest thing that I've noticed as a challenge is that because for me at a young age that was lost and I had to find ways to kind of like redevelop it with people on the way. For you, it's a little bit later on in life. How do you redevelop that from a sense of rejection or abandonment? Like how do you, um, like tap into that again, knowing that in the past people have misled you on certain paths and ways to a point where you may not be able to trust anyone fully.
Yeah. I think the burden is on them, on the people.
Mm,
And even if they've come into your life and they're new in your life, I think the burden is on them to prove it to you that they can be trusted.
mm-hmm,
Because, there's only so many times that you can get burned and then you just become jaded. And
mm-hmm,
so I think I've been real close to that. And you just have to be really careful of who you let come into your life. And maybe it's a lonely time, but you can't be taken advantage of. And
mm-hmm,
so yeah, I think you have to sometimes experience those lonely moments and wait around or seek out people that you think will be like-minded and trustworthy.
mm.
So yeah, be
Awesome.
sparing with what you give them. So
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense.
mhm.
Kelsey, how do people find you, and what are some of the things that you have coming up that people can follow?
Okay, you can find me on Instagram at
Mm-hmm,
From Another Mother, and then I have a website FromAnotherMother.com.
mm-hmm,
And then I'm doing a Mother's Day project right now. It ends at the end of, or at the middle of next week. It ends May 1st, but people are sending Mother's Day cards in, and we're sending them out to birth moms across the world, really. So that's super exciting. We've got about 300 women signed up to receive cards, and so that's great. I guess
Now,
that's really what I have going on right now, and then I start law school in the fall. So
that's awesome. Now, are
yeah.
these cards, are they words of inspiration, or what is the purpose behind the cards?
The purpose is to preserve and recognize motherhood
Mm-hmm.
for birth moms. Because I mean, adoption is so hard anyways, and
Mm-hmm.
then to go through Mother's Day and no one says anything to you, and you're kind of like the elephant in the room, but everyone just pushes you off to the side. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that recognizing their motherhood helps them, but also helps educate others on their role and their
Mm.
significance. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, it sounds like a terrific project. Um, Thank you so much for being a guest on our show, and like I said, sharing your experience. It was good for me to hear another perspective, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners, as far as kind of like your own personal journey and why you decided to do the work that you do right now. So I wanted to thank you for that, and thank you for being so open as well.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.